Thank you. Now, we can do a bit of a panel discussion. I would cap the time unless people want to leave. I honestly don't know what to do.
Just have a couple of questions.
Couple questions. Let's get all the speakers up here because we do have a couple of questions.
All right, let's do it.
And John Frazier, who has a couple of questions.
Okay, I have a little pocket full of questions here. First one, for Father Weil, and others may answer as well. How do we address the fact that a saint has faults?
Well, first of all, the church is very aware that there are no perfect people. And she has a long history of looking at the lives of people to raise them up to the altars of the church. So, very simply, as a postulator, I have to be careful of sanitizing Catherine or neglecting faults in her life. For example, when I interview people, I ask them very pointed questions. Did you ever experience any anger from Catherine or impatience or whatever? So what comes to me is that, if I may say this to Chestertonians, with the possible cause looming, it's more of a caution. We have to be careful of over-idealizing Chesterton, not to make up faults or not to address things in his life that we think, he could have been a better Christian. So very simply, I think I'd like to say that not to be over defensive about what may be faults in Chesterton. There are no perfect people. And Chesterton himself was the one most aware of that he was not perfect.
I think that could be said for all of the saints too. If they weren't perfect, they would readily admit that problem.
I'm finding that this is a good deal more sensitive than I knew it was, so sorry to wake you all up there earlier. But okay, next question, not addressed to any one person in particular, but I think we have heard well represented the, quote, externalistic school of mystical theology, unquote. Yet Jesus prescribes expressly shutting one's door to pray the Lord's Prayer. Why do you think he said that?
You know, what's really interesting is how little we know about Chesterton's own prayer life. I mean, that sheds some light on it, doesn't it? But, you know, he kept his own spiritual life to himself, and it's just not a matter of public record. We know he had a rosary, but he never talks about praying a rosary. I've held his beads in my hand, and they're well used. And you know, it was next to his bed when he died. The only time he talks about prayer is he says, if I could have any prayer, it would be that I never forget anything.
At what point in his life did GKC have mystical apprehensions?
I just wanted to go out and sort of say mystical apprehensions, just to show I can do it. Actually, the thing that struck me in that is that early on in the early 1890s, when he was at Slade School of Art, he fell under the influence of the decadence up to a point and even sort of philosophers, dark philosophers, pessimistic philosophers such as Schopenhauer. And there's this line, which I'm also probably going to garble, from an early poem, Once or Twice of Assisi. Obviously, his writings of Twice of Assisi is full of mysticism and Chesterton's love for God and for creation. But in this, he says, is it God's white house we live in, or a vault of dark confusion, or something like that? So in other words, at that stage, he's grappling mystically, apprehensively about, do we live in God's creation, or is there ultimately nothing? And of course, within 5 or 6 years, he recoiled and we emerged from that into this wonderful Chesterton we now know.
I'm not sure what the person means by mystical apprehensions. I don't really understand.
He said it's in there.
I think you can ask Joseph if he wrote it. No, I'm
I always think that in such a book as St. Francis of Assisi, the insights he had into the mysticism of such a saint as great as St. Francis was, you almost think, well, he must have gone through that himself. For example, St. Francis goes into the cave, and Chesterton comments, we don't know what went on in that close union between God and Francis. And then he goes on to speculate, he says, well, perhaps Francis saw the world upside down. He saw it hanging by a thread. And that permeated his whole being. I mean, you see something in depth. And Thomas Aquinas said, of all the arguments for the existence of God, there's only one that's really good. And that is the one from existence, that each of us and the whole cosmos, second by second, is being held, we have existence, or not. And, he said one time in Orthodoxy, he said, primitive man knew that he couldn't make the grass grow. And well, today, that's pretty well where we are. The depth of his remarks, it seems so simple, except they're so sublime and so deep. But I've often thought, well, in order to mention these things to us, he had to explore and find them and make them a part of himself. And there's so much mystical theology in St. Francis, that book. Often I'll tell people, well, you heard it said that don't start with St. Thomas Aquinas, that's an impossible book. Take an easy one, like St. Francis of Assisi. I think to myself, that book is not easy. It goes in depth into spiritual theology in a way that it's just astounding, actually. And it's not easy to write about mystical theology either.
Okay, last question. If Chesterton were alive today, what would he say about the upcoming synod?
I think the cleric should maybe take a hack at that
What I've been reading about the synod and the plans for the synod and so on, and what comes back to me all the time when I read some of this material, not necessarily the pundits who are saying, here are the cardinals that are going to be saying this, and here are the theologians that are going to be saying that, but I'm talking about the whole concept of the synod and the family. I just think about what's wrong with the world.
And there are so many passages from that book that come to mind when you look at what the Holy Father is talking about regarding the family and the importance of the family in the 21st century and how we need to get this thing straightened out. And I think Chesterton, if he were alive today, he would be someone who would want to participate in it and someone who would want to talk about the importance of the family, because he's got the key insight in what's wrong with the world and other places, that you don't let the world dictate the parameters of the discussion. You find out what you believe to be important, namely, in this case, the family as the source of the whole thing, how culture is passed on, how culture should be passed on. Governments and things like that are too big to do that, Chesterton says, too big to do it well. You have to realize how important the family is, and then figure out how you're going to make that family work in a world that is, at least in the West, extremely antagonistic to the whole presuppositions around the family. And I think, therefore, if he were around today, he would support the importance of this, that he would think it would be a fundamental thing for the 21st century. He stood back from the 21st century and said, what should the church be tackling right now? I think he would say the family, to deal with that family issue.
As I'm passing it to Joseph, I'd say that if he were around today, he would be asked to participate.
Yeah.
Because he was such a recognized giant of intellect, and his cultural criticism was so sought after, just like he was asked to speak at the Eucharistic Congress. I think he would be sought out for his opinion. And he did recognize that the family is the thing most under attack in our world. And what we hope is that someone who is involved in the synod recognizes Chesterton's prophetic voice and perhaps invokes it.
Yes, the only thing I would say is obviously we live in a time now where the traditional family is under even greater attack than it was during Chesterton's time. Chesterton's writing on the family is now emerging as prophecy of where things would lead, because that's where they're leading. And I think what Chesterton would say, were he alive today, the synod, is that we don't want a synod that will move with the world, but a synod that will move the world.
Nice, Joseph. That was good.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks so much for coming. Max will